She thought she'd moved on until she saw him again. If you're new to my channel, make sure to support by subscribing and turning on the notifications. Your support means everything. All right, let's dive into the story. She thought she had erased him from her life. Years had passed, and she had built a new world, one where his name didn't echo in her mind anymore, or so she believed. But then she saw him, sitting at the far end of the cafe, casually stirring his coffee, looking almost the same, yet different. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in this city, not in her life again. Her fingers tightened around her cup, her breath shaky. She could turn around, walk away, pretend she never saw him. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed for a split second, told her he had seen her too. And just like that, the past she had buried came roaring back to life. For a moment she thought he'd look away, pretend he didn't see her, just like she had planned to do, but he didn't. Instead, his eyes locked onto hers, holding her in place like a force she couldn't fight. It was the same stare, the one that once made her feel like the only girl in the world. But now it was unreadable, a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Her pulse pounded. She wasn't ready for this. Not for the way her body betrayed her, not for the way her past refused to stay buried. She turned to leave. Run before it's too late. But then his voice stopped her. You still take 2 sugars, don't you? Her heart dropped. How did he still remember? She froze. 2 sugars. A detail so small, yet it felt like a whispered confession of everything they once were. Slowly she turned back, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Why did he say that? Why now, after all these years? He tilted his head slightly, studying her reaction. He knew what he was doing. He knew this would shake her, and it did. Her lips parted, but no words came out, because deep down she wasn't sure what scared her more, the fact that he still remembered, or the fact that she had never forgotten. She forced a smile, masking the storm inside her. It's just coffee, she said, trying to sound unaffected. He chuckled softly. Is it? That one question hit harder than it should have, because they both knew this wasn't just coffee. This was history, regret, and 1,000 unsaid words packed into a single moment. Her feet felt heavy, her mind screaming at her to leave. But instead, she did the one thing she swore she wouldn't. She walked toward him. She didn't know why she sat down. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was closure. Or maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as over him as she thought. He watched her closely, as if memorizing every detail. You look different, he said, his voice softer now. She exhaled a quiet laugh. You don't. But he did. His face held the same features, the same eyes. Yet there was something else now. A weight, a story she didn't know. And for the first time in years, she found herself wondering, had life been just as unkind to him as it had been to her? Silence stretched between them, thick with everything they weren't saying. She should have walked away. She should have ignored the way her pulse raced. But instead, she asked the one question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. So, how have you been? His fingers tapped lightly against his cup, a hesitation, a sign she still knew how to read. Good, he lied, and just like that, she was drowning in old habits, reading between his words, searching for the truth in his silence. Because if there was one thing she still remembered about him, it was that he never said what he truly felt. She arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. Good? She repeated, challenging his lie without saying it outright. He let out a quiet sigh, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. And you? Her throat tightened. This was it. The moment she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her head, where she would smile effortlessly and say, I moved on, I'm happy, so why did it feel like the hardest lie to tell? She forced herself to nod. I moved on. His jaw clenched for just a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then he chuckled softly and leaned back. Yeah, me too. And yet neither of them moved. The cafe buzzed around them, clinking cups, quiet chatter, the hum of a world that had moved on. But inside this moment, time stood still. She traced the rim of her cup, avoiding his gaze. She should have felt relief. They had both moved on, hadn't they? That's what she wanted to hear. So why did it feel like a confession wrapped in regret? Then before she could stop herself, the words slipped out, soft, uncertain, dangerous. Do you ever think about it? His fingers stilled against the table. His eyes met hers, darker now, and when he finally spoke, his answer changed everything. He exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Then he gave her the truth. Every damn day. Her breath hitched. She wasn't ready for that, for the weight of his words, for the raw honesty in his voice. She had spent years convincing herself that she was just a chapter in his past, that he had moved on, just like she told herself she had. But now she wasn't so sure. She swallowed hard, her heart slamming against her ribs. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to smile, nod, maybe even laugh it off, but instead, she felt her walls cracking. Then why did you let me go? The question slipped out before she could stop it. His jaw tightened. A shadow crossed his face. Regret. Guilt. Maybe both. Because I thought it was the right thing to do. His voice was quiet, but the pain in it was deafening. She let out a bitter laugh. And was it? He didn't answer, and in that silence, she got her answer. The silence between them felt heavier than words ever could. She let out a shaky breath, leaning back. So, you thought walking away was the right thing? His fingers curled into a fist on the table. I didn't think I knew. She scoffed. And yet here we are. His eyes darkened. Yeah, here we are. For years, she had imagined this moment, thought she'd feel anger, closure, something that would make moving on easier, but all she felt was the same ache she thought she had buried long ago, and the terrifying realization that maybe he was feeling it too. She shook her head, letting out a dry laugh. You talk like you had no choice. His jaw clenched. Maybe I didn't. She frowned, searching his face. What does that even mean? For a moment he hesitated, like he was debating whether to say it. Then he leaned in. You think I wanted to leave you? That it was easy for me? His voice was low, sharp, filled with something raw. Her breath caught. He had never said this before, never looked at her like this, like he was still fighting a war she never knew existed. And suddenly, for the first time since seeing him again, she realized she might not know the full story. Her pulse quickened. Then tell me. The words came out softer than she intended. Tell me why you left. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You think it's that simple? Her eyes burned. It should be. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time that night she saw it, the weight he'd been carrying all these years. Then he spoke. I left because I had to protect you. A chill ran down her spine. Protect me? She leaned forward, voice barely a whisper. From what? And his answer shattered everything she thought she knew. His eyes darkened, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. From me. Her breath caught. From him, she shook her head. That doesn't make sense. A bitter smile ghosted his lips. Doesn't it? Something in his voice sent a shiver through her. This wasn't just regret. This was something deeper, something he had buried just like she had. I wasn't the person you thought I was. His voice was low, rough, and if you had known the truth back then, you never would have loved me. Her heart clenched. Try me. For the first time that night he looked away, and that silence told her one thing. He was afraid she actually would. She leaned closer, her voice steady. Tell me. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple like he was fighting a war inside his head. Then He finally looked at her. I wasn't who you thought I was, and I was terrified that one day you'd find out. Her chest tightened. Find out what? His fingers drummed against the table, his jaw clenched tight. Then, with a quiet, almost broken voice, he said it. That I didn't deserve you. The words hit harder than she expected. Not because they were true, but because he actually believed them. And in that moment she realized maybe losing him had never been her choice at all.